The war entered its 7th day, and Commander Vrath stood in the ruins of a human city called St. Louis. His forces had captured it after 3 days of the most brutal combat he had ever experienced. Every building had been a fortress. Every street had been a trap. The humans had fought for every room, every floor, every inch of ground. Of the 5,000 Zeltharian troops he sent into the city, less than 2,000 remained combat-ready. The victory felt hollow and bitter. St. Louis was just one city, and Earth had hundreds more. At this rate, he would run out of soldiers long before running out of cities to conquer. His tactical officer reported that human forces had retreated across the river and destroyed all the bridges behind them. They were fortifying new positions on the far side, preparing to make the Zeltharians pay again for every meter of advance. Vrath felt tired in a way he had never experienced before. This was not war as he understood it. This was something darker and more desperate. In the Pentagon Command Center, General Paul Martinez reviewed casualty reports with his staff. The numbers were devastating. 40,000 American soldiers dead, 120,000 wounded. Global casualties were 3 times higher. Civilian deaths from the orbital bombardment in the first days totaled over 2 million people. President Marcus Webb listened from a secure video link, his face showing the weight of every lost life. Each number represented a person, a family destroyed, someone who would never see their home again. But Admiral Stephen Grant had some good news to balance the horror. Intelligence estimated the Zeltharians had lost 60% of their ground forces and 70% of their fleet. Dr. Helen Park confirmed that Commander Vrath had requested reinforcements from his empire, but the nearest Zeltharian fleet was weeks away. The aliens on Earth were trapped, cut off from supply and support. They were still dangerous, but they were also isolated and weakening. General Martinez cautioned against celebration. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides were running low on supplies. The question now was simple: who would break first? Colonel Jake Morrison did not care about strategic calculations. He cared about the 23 soldiers still alive in his command. The Razor Squad had been reinforced with survivors from other units, but they had lost so many. Now they held a defensive position at a farm in Iowa, watching for Zeltharian scouts. Sergeant Amy Price sat next to him, cleaning her rifle. Her arm was wrapped in bandages from a plasma burn 2 days ago. Half the squad carried similar wounds. They were tired, hungry, and running low on ammunition, but they were still fighting. Amy asked Jake a question that had been bothering her. Was it worth it? All the death, all the destruction? Should they have just surrendered and saved lives? Jake thought carefully before answering. He told her about the species the Zeltharians had conquered before. The intelligence report said those populations became slaves, worked to death in mines and factories. The survivors lived in fear, their cultures destroyed, their freedom taken. He asked Amy if that was better than fighting. She admitted it was not. But the cost was so high. So many people dead, Jake agreed. The cost was terrible. But they were still here, still fighting, still free. That counted for something. Their conversation was interrupted by a priority transmission. Captain Linda Hayes appeared on Jake's communication screen, and she looked shocked. The Zeltharians had requested a ceasefire. They wanted to talk. Jake and Amy exchanged surprised glances. A ceasefire could mean many things. Surrender terms, a trap, or maybe something else. But orders were orders. Jake told his squad to hold position and wait. Commander Vrath's face appeared on screens around the world. His translator converted his alien speech into dozens of human languages. The alien commander looked exhausted, his features showing something that might have been pain or regret. Vrath spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said he had come to Earth expecting an easy victory. The Zeltharian Empire believed humans were weak because of their primitive technology and divided governments. They were wrong. He paused, and one of his 3 eyes closed briefly. He said humans had fought with a determination he had never seen in 40 years of military service. Human soldiers refused to surrender even when facing certain death. Human civilians took up weapons rather than submit. Humanity had proven that advancement was measured not in technology, but in will. President Webb listened from the Situation Room, his advisors silent around him. Nobody spoke. Everyone wanted to hear what the alien commander would say next. Vrath continued. He said his empire had ordered him to continue the conquest regardless of cost. They said retreat would make the Empire look weak to rivals in the galaxy. But Vrath was refusing that order. His soldiers had bled enough for pride. Humanity had suffered enough for their freedom. The alien commander looked directly into the camera. He announced he was withdrawing all Zeltharian forces from Earth. They would return to their ships and leave the solar system. The war was over. Stunned silence filled every command center on Earth. Admiral Grant was the first to speak, asking if it was a trick. But sensors confirmed that Zeltharian troops were pulling back from all positions. They were moving toward their landing zones, not in retreat but in organized withdrawal. They were not charging weapons or preparing attacks. They were leaving. President Webb made a decision quickly. He opened a direct channel to Commander Vrath. The two leaders faced each other across the video link, human and alien, both exhausted by war. Webb asked if the withdrawal was genuine. Were they really leaving? Vrath confirmed it, but he made clear this was not surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal. The Zeltharian Empire would debate Earth's status for years. Some would want revenge. Others would argue that any species capable of defeating them should be left alone. The debate would continue long after Vrath was gone. Webb asked what Vrath would tell his empire about humanity. Vrath's translator struggled for a moment before delivering his response. He would tell them the truth. That humans were dangerous not despite their primitive nature, but because of it. Humans fought with creativity born from desperation. They used weapons that civilized species considered obsolete. They employed tactics no advanced military would consider. They were barbarians who had learned to reach the stars, and that made them more dangerous than any empire. He leaned closer to the camera. He would recommend that Earth be avoided, not because of human weapons, but because of what humanity might become if they survived long enough to develop real technology. Species like humans always survived. History proved that. And when they did, they became unstoppable. The transmission ended. Across Earth, people watched as Zeltharian troops boarded their landing craft and returned to orbit. The alien fleet, battered and reduced by half, gathered its strength and prepared to leave. In the Pentagon, General Martinez sat down heavily. The weight of the past week finally hit him all at once. They had actually done it. They had fought off an alien invasion. Dr. Helen Park asked the question quietly. At what cost? The casualty reports would take months to fully compile. 250,000 soldiers dead defending Earth. 3 million civilians killed in bombardment and fighting. 50 cities damaged or destroyed. The economic cost was incalculable. Years of rebuilding lay ahead. Decades of healing, but they had survived. When a superior force came to conquer them, humanity had refused to yield. When the enemy had better weapons, humans fought with determination. When facing superior numbers, they fought with intelligence. In the end, the aliens left not because they were defeated in battle, but because the cost of victory was too high. President Webb addressed the world from the streets of Washington, standing among soldiers and civilians in front of damaged buildings. He did not speak from the safety of the White House. He wanted people to see him among the rubble, sharing their pain. Webb called his audience not Americans or any nationality, but humans. One species united by survival. He acknowledged the terrible cost of victory. The soldiers who gave their lives, the civilians who died defending their homes, the cities that lay in ruins, all of it would be mourned and remembered, but they had survived. When aliens came to conquer them, humans refused to quit. When facing impossible odds, they found ways to fight back. When told to surrender, they chose to resist. And in the end, they made the cost too high for the invaders. Webb looked directly at the camera. He spoke not to Earth, but to the galaxy beyond, to the species watching from the stars. He knew they were out there studying what had happened. He said Earth did not seek war. Humans hope for peace, for cooperation, for friendship with other species. But if others came with conquest in mind, they would find what the Zeltharians found. Humans do not quit. They would fight with everything they had. They would turn their weaknesses into weapons. They would make every battle cost more than it was worth. Webb's expression was hard but honest. Come in peace and find no better friends. Come in war and find no worse enemies. The choice was theirs. On the Zeltharian flagship, Commander Vrath watched the human president's speech. He felt something like respect for these terrifying primitives. They would make valuable allies one day if his empire was wise enough to see it. He would recommend that in his report, the fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives and departed. The alien ships appeared at the edge of the solar system without warning. They came from deep space, their dark vessels blocking out the stars behind them. Commander Vrath stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking at the small blue planet ahead. His three eyes studied the data on his screens. The planet was called Earth, and according to his scouts, the creatures living there were weak and primitive. Vrath had conquered 12 worlds before this one. Each time the native species had surrendered quickly when they saw his fleet. Some tried to fight, but their weapons were useless against Zeltharian shields and armor. This time would be no different. The humans had barely left their own planet. They had no real weapons, no shields, and no chance. On Earth, it was early morning when the alarms started going off. Lieutenant Danny Cole was sitting at his station in the North American Aerospace Defense Command, drinking cold coffee and watching his screens. Suddenly, every sensor he had started flashing red. His coffee cup fell from his hand as he stared at the impossible readings. Hundreds of contacts were appearing on his screen. They were huge, moving in formation and coming straight toward Earth. Danny's hands shook as he pressed the alert button. Captain Linda Hayes rushed over to his station. She was a veteran officer who had seen many crises, but her face went pale when she saw the readings. She grabbed the phone that connected directly to the Pentagon. Within an hour, every major government on Earth knew the truth. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and their new neighbors were not friendly. President Marcus Webb sat in a secure room deep underground, surrounded by military officers and scientists. Dr. Helen Park, the head of NASA, showed them images of the alien fleet. The ships were massive, each one bigger than an aircraft carrier. Their technology was far beyond anything humans had ever built. General Paul Martinez asked the question everyone was thinking. What could they do against such a powerful enemy? Admiral Stephen Grant looked at the holographic display showing the alien fleet. He had spent his entire career preparing for war, but never against aliens. The orbital defense platforms Earth had built were designed to stop missiles, not alien warships. They had weapons that were only 6 months old, built just in case something like this ever happened. Now it was happening, and they were not ready. President Webb listened to his advisors argue about options. Some wanted to try talking to the aliens. Others said they should prepare to surrender. But Webb remembered history. He remembered stories of battles where smaller forces refused to give up, even when they had no chance of winning. Those stories always ended badly for someone, but at least those people had tried. The alien message arrived 18 hours after they were first detected. It was broadcast on every radio frequency, every television channel, every communication system on Earth. The translation was rough, but the meaning was clear. The aliens called themselves the Zeltharians. They said Earth now belonged to their empire. Humans had 24 hours to surrender, or the aliens would destroy every city on the planet. It was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. In a military base deep under the Pentagon, Colonel Jake Morrison gathered his team. They called themselves the Razor Squad, and they were the best special operations soldiers America had. Jake had led them through wars in deserts, jungles, and mountains. Now he was about to lead them into space. Jake looked at his team. They were scared. He could see it in their eyes, but they were also ready. Sergeant Amy Price was checking her rifle, the same weapon she had carried for 10 years. She looked up at Jake and nodded. Jake explained the plan. The Navy was modifying a military space station called the ISS Drake. They were loading it with every weapon they had. The Razor Squad would go up with a small fleet of ships and attack the alien fleet before it reached Earth. Everyone knew it was a suicide mission, but nobody complained. Private Kevin Nash made a joke about at least getting a good view before they died. A few people laughed, but the laughter was hollow. Commander Vrath watched human communications with curiosity. His computers translated their languages and showed him their broadcasts. He saw images of human history, their wars, their battles, their refusal to surrender even when they were losing. It puzzled him. These humans had no advanced technology. Their weapons were primitive. Their ships were slow. Yet everywhere he looked in their communications, he saw defiance. They were not preparing to surrender. They were preparing to fight. Vrath's tactical officer mentioned that perhaps they should be careful. Human culture seemed to celebrate war and violence. Every entertainment broadcast showed humans fighting each other. Their entire history was one long story of conflict. Vrath dismissed the concern. Primitive species always fought among themselves. It meant nothing. What mattered was that the Zeltharians had better weapons, better shields, and better ships. The battle would be over quickly. But deep in the data his computers were collecting, there was something the Zeltharians missed. Humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years. They had gotten very good at it. They had developed weapons, tactics, and strategies that filled libraries. They had learned how to win when they were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Now they were about to use all that knowledge against a new enemy. In Houston, Lieutenant Sophie Grant sat in the cockpit of a new type of fighter. The X-47 Wraith was humanity's first real space combat aircraft. It had been built in secret over the past 6 months when strange readings were detected near Mars. Now those readings made sense. Sophie ran through her pre-flight checks, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Around the world, similar preparations were happening. Missile silos that had been dormant for years were opening. Secret weapons that were supposed to never be used were being activated. Submarines were receiving orders to move into position. Every soldier, every sailor, every pilot was getting ready for the fight of their lives. President Webb spoke to the world that evening. His speech was short but powerful. He told the aliens they had made a mistake. They thought humans would surrender because they had better technology. But technology was not everything. Humans had survived ice ages, diseases, and disasters that should have killed them all. They had fought each other for thousands of years and learned how to survive impossible situations. Webb looked directly into the camera. He said the aliens wanted war and they would get one. But they should know that humans do not fight fair. They do not give up, and they do not know when to quit. Commander Vrath heard the translation and laughed. In 72 hours, his fleet would reach Earth. In 73 hours, the planet would surrender. The humans were brave, but bravery meant nothing against superior firepower. But Colonel Jake Morrison was already launching from Earth orbit, leading his small fleet toward the alien armada. Behind him came 1,000 more ships carrying weapons and soldiers ready to die for their planet. The war for Earth was beginning, and the Zeltharians were about to learn that humans were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The Zeltharian fleet moved closer to Earth, their massive ships gliding through space in perfect formation. Commander Vrath was confident as he watched the primitive human vessels approaching his fleet. His sensors counted them easily. A few hundred small ships carrying weapons that could not possibly hurt his advanced warships. His shields could stop anything the humans had. Or so he thought. Colonel Jake Morrison sat in his assault shuttle watching the alien fleet grow larger on his screen. His hands were steady on the controls even though his heart was pounding. Behind him, the Razor Squad was strapped into their seats, checking weapons and equipment one final time. They all knew this was probably their last mission. Jake opened a communication channel to all the human ships. His voice was calm as he reminded them of the plan. Get close to the aliens, release their weapons, and get away as fast as possible. Simple, dangerous, and probably crazy. But it was the only plan they had. The Zeltharians opened fire first. Bright blue plasma bolts streaked across space, hitting 2 human shuttles instantly. The ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Jake watched 2 of his fellow pilots die, but he did not slow down. The mission was more important than any one life. Sergeant Amy Price called out the distance. 30 seconds until they reached the release point. The shuttle shook as plasma bolts passed close by, the heat making their instruments scream warnings. But they kept going. Jake gave the order to release. The shuttles dropped their cargo and turned hard, engines burning at maximum power to escape. Behind them, 30 nuclear weapons drifted toward the alien fleet. But these were not ordinary nuclear bombs. Human engineers had modified them with special materials designed to create massive electromagnetic pulses. Commander Vrath saw the primitive nuclear devices approaching and smiled. His shields could easily absorb nuclear explosions. The humans were wasting their weapons on attacks that could not work. He ordered his crew to ignore the bombs and focus on destroying the remaining shuttles. Then the bombs exploded. The blast was not designed to break through the shields. Captain Linda Hayes, watching from Earth, knew that would be impossible. Instead, the nuclear explosions created a massive wave of electromagnetic radiation that blinded every sensor on the Zeltharian fleet. Their shields held, but suddenly they could not see anything. Their weapons could not target the humans. Their sensors showed nothing but static. That was when the real attack began. Hidden in the asteroid belt, 20 submarines waited. They were not normal submarines that traveled underwater. These had been secretly modified to work in space, equipped with experimental engines and weapons. The USS Wyoming, commanded by Captain Betty Ross, had been waiting in the cold of space for this moment. Betty gave the order to fire. The submarines launched railgun projectiles, massive chunks of metal moving at incredible speed. The Zeltharian shields were still recovering from the electromagnetic pulse. The kinetic rounds hit the alien ships like hammers hitting glass. 3 Zeltharian warships shattered completely, their hulls unable to withstand the pure physics of mass multiplied by velocity. 4 more ships were badly damaged, atmosphere leaking into space as their crews struggled to seal the breaches. On the Zeltharian flagship, alarms were sounding everywhere. Commander Vrath grabbed his command chair to keep from falling as the ship rocked from impacts. His tactical officer was shouting reports about damaged ships, failed shields, and casualties. Vrath could not believe what was happening. The humans had tricked them. Their nuclear weapons were not meant to destroy, only to blind. The real attack came from simple kinetic weapons that did not need fancy technology to kill. The submarines were already moving, disappearing back into the asteroid field before the Zeltharians could target them. Vrath ordered his ships to pursue, but the asteroids provided too much cover. The humans knew this battlefield, and they were using every advantage. On Earth, Lieutenant Sophie Grant received her launch order. The X-47 Wraith fighter dropped from its orbital platform, its powerful engine pushing her back into her seat. Around her, 99 more Wraiths launched, forming up into attack squadrons. Sophie had trained for months in simulators, but this was different. This was real. She could see the alien fleet ahead, some ships damaged and leaking atmosphere. She armed her weapons and dove toward the enemy. The Wraiths carried no missiles or energy weapons. Instead, they had rotary cannons that fired depleted uranium rounds. The same type of weapon that had been used in Earth's wars for decades. Simple, reliable, and deadly. Sophie lined up on a damaged Zeltharian cruiser and opened fire. Her cannon roared, sending a stream of rounds into the exposed hull. Each round punched through the alien metal, creating small holes that explosively decompressed the interior. She saw the cruiser begin to list as it lost power. The Zeltharians tried to shoot down the small fighters, but their weapons were designed for large ships, not for fast, agile craft like the Wraiths. The human pilots flew patterns that would have been impossible in atmosphere, spinning and rolling in ways that confused the alien targeting systems. Lieutenant Carlos Mendoza, Sophie's wingman, destroyed a weapons platform on another cruiser. He whooped in excitement over the radio before remembering to maintain discipline. But everyone understood. They were actually hurting the aliens. It seemed impossible, but it was happening. In the Pentagon Situation Room, President Webb watched the battle unfold on holographic displays. Dr. Helen Park stood next to him, her earlier fear replaced with something like hope. They were winning. It should not be possible, but the humans were actually winning. General Paul Martinez cautioned against too much optimism. They had destroyed 7 alien ships and damaged 20 more. But the Zeltharians still had numerical superiority, and humanity had used most of their surprises. When the aliens reached Earth orbit, the defenders would have fewer tricks to use. Admiral Stephen Grant agreed. The next phase would be harder. The aliens would learn from their mistakes, adapt their tactics, and come back with better defenses. The humans needed to keep hitting them, keep them off balance, never let them recover. Commander Vrath was having similar thoughts. He studied the casualty reports with growing anger. 17 ships destroyed, 40 damaged, and they had not even reached the planet yet. These humans fought with a savagery that made no sense. They sacrificed their own people for small advantages. They used weapons that should have been obsolete. They did not fight like any civilized species he had encountered. His science officer explained that the humans were using their technological backwardness as a weapon. Zeltharian shields were designed to stop energy weapons and known projectiles. They were not optimized against simple kinetic weapons moving at high velocity. The humans had found a weakness by accident, just by being primitive. A transmission came through from one of the human ships. Colonel Jake Morrison appeared on the screen, his face scarred and his expression hard. He spoke in a language the translator struggled with, but the message was clear enough. The human was taunting them. Jake told the Zeltharians they could still turn around and go home. Tell their empire that Earth was protected, but if they kept coming, they would learn something important about humans. Humanity had been killing each other for 10,000 years. They were very good at it, and now they had a common enemy. The transmission ended. Vrath stared at the empty screen. Every instinct told him to retreat, to report that this system was too dangerous to conquer. But his pride would not allow it. The Zeltharian Empire did not retreat from primitives. He ordered the fleet to continue toward Earth. The human forces regrouped after the first battle. They had lost 30 shuttles, 12 Wraith fighters, and 1 submarine. Those losses hurt, but they had proven something important. The aliens could be beaten. Their shields could be overwhelmed. Their ships could be destroyed. The impossible was possible. Sophie Grant landed her Wraith fighter back at the Houston base, her fuel almost completely gone. Ground crews swarmed her ship, reloading weapons and patching damage. She had 20 minutes before she had to launch again. Her crew chief told her the numbers. 18 Wraiths had not returned from the battle. 18 pilots who would never see Earth again. Sophie felt the weight of those losses, but she could not afford to dwell on them. The fight was not over. Across the solar system, humanity prepared for round 2. The Zeltharians had been bloodied but not beaten. They were adapting, learning, getting ready for the next engagement, and they still had enough firepower to destroy Earth if they reached orbit. But humans had more tricks ready, more weapons hidden in unlikely places, more tactics that civilized species would never consider. The Zeltharians wanted a war, and humanity was showing them what war really meant. Commander Vrath ordered his fleet into tighter formation, shields at maximum, sensors scanning for any hidden threats. He would not be caught off guard again. His fleet would reach Earth, establish orbital control, and force the humans to surrender. The cost had been higher than expected, but victory was still certain, or so he believed. What Vrath did not understand was that humans had been preparing for this fight for generations. Every science fiction story, every alien invasion movie, every war game had imagined this scenario. When the aliens finally came, the Zeltharian fleet entered Earth's orbit 51 hours after the first battle. Commander Vrath had learned his lesson. His ships stayed in tight formation, shields at maximum power, sensors scanning constantly for threats. He would not be surprised again. The humans had proven more dangerous than expected, but now he was ready for their tricks. What he did not know was that Earth's orbit had been turned into a death trap. The Zeltharian sensors detected thousands of objects floating in orbit. They were small, barely larger than satellites, and they seemed inactive. Vrath studied the readings with suspicion. Were they weapons, decoys, debris from destroyed satellites? His tactical officer suggested they might be leftover pieces from Earth's early space program. Humans had a history of leaving junk in orbit around their planet. Vrath wanted to believe that, but something felt wrong. The objects were positioned too deliberately, spread across every orbital layer in patterns that seemed almost mathematical. In the Pentagon Command Center, General Paul Martinez watched the alien fleet enter the trap. Dr. Helen Park stood beside him, nervously checking her calculations one more time. The plan was risky and expensive, but it was their best chance. Admiral Stephen Grant gave the order. 3,000 satellites suddenly came to life. They were not really satellites anymore. Engineers had gutted commercial satellites and filled them with explosives, simple guidance systems, and basic AI. The military called them Hornets, and they had cost more money than any previous defense project in human history. Now they would prove their worth or humanity would fall. The Hornets accelerated toward the Zeltharian fleet from every direction. They moved fast, changing direction randomly, making it impossible for targeting systems to predict their paths. The aliens opened fire immediately, their plasma cannons destroying hundreds of Hornets in the first few seconds. But there were thousands of them. For every Hornet destroyed, 10 more got through. Commander Vrath watched in horror as the small human devices swarmed his fleet like angry insects. Each impact was small, just an explosion of chemical explosives, but there were so many. His shields flickered under the constant bombardment. Warning lights flashed across his command center. Ships reported shield failures, hull breaches, system damage. He ordered the fleet to push through to get to lower orbit where they could begin bombarding the planet. The ships dove deeper into Earth's gravity well, their shields absorbing hit after hit. Behind them, more Hornets gave chase, exploding against the weakening defenses. Lieutenant Danny Cole stood outside the NORAD headquarters, watching the sky light up with explosions. Each flash was a Hornet dying to protect Earth, and each flash weakened the alien shields a little more. He whispered encouragement to the autonomous weapons, knowing they could not hear him but feeling like he needed to say something. The Zeltharian fleet reached lower orbit with their shields at 30% capacity. They had survived the Hornet swarm, but barely. Commander Vrath allowed himself a moment of relief before ordering his weapons officer to target Earth's major cities: Beijing, Delhi, London, New York. He would make the humans pay for their resistance. The plasma cannons charged, building the energy needed to vaporize everything within kilometers of the impact point. Vrath gave the order to fire. The massive energy beams launched toward Earth, enough power to kill millions of people in seconds. In command centers around the world, humans held their breath and prayed their desperate plan would work. The plasma bolts hit invisible barriers in the upper atmosphere and exploded harmlessly. The energy scattered across the sky in brilliant displays of light. Cities below felt brief heat waves but remained intact. No buildings fell. No people died. On the Zeltharian flagship, Vrath stared at his screens in disbelief. His weapons officer reported that some kind of electromagnetic field was dispersing their plasma weapons. The energy was spreading out instead of concentrating on the target. The science officer explained that humans were using primitive electromagnetic field technology, something the Zeltharians had abandoned thousands of years ago. Their modern weapons were not designed to penetrate such crude defenses because no advanced species still used them. Vrath wanted to laugh at the irony. The humans were protected by their own backwardness. Their primitive technology actually worked better against Zeltharian weapons than advanced shields would have. He ordered his crews to switch to kinetic bombardment. Solid projectiles would not be stopped by electromagnetic fields. But as the Zeltharians retargeted their weapons, Earth launched its next surprise. Missiles rose from hidden silos across multiple continents. They were not nuclear missiles, though those were ready if needed. These missiles had a simpler but more effective payload. As they reached the upper atmosphere, they exploded and released their cargo. Millions of small steel balls spread across the path of the Zeltharian fleet. Each ball was smaller than a marble, but moving at orbital velocity. The alien ships, already damaged and with weakened shields, flew directly into the cloud of projectiles. The sound was like rain hitting a metal roof, except each raindrop punched through armor plating. Thousands of tiny holes appeared in ship hulls. Atmosphere vented into space. Critical systems failed. Ships that had survived nuclear weapons found themselves destroyed by what was essentially buckshot. Admiral Stephen Grant watched the results and allowed himself a smile. The idea had come from an engineer in Ohio who submitted it to the Pentagon 3 months ago. Everyone had laughed at the proposal until someone actually calculated the physics. Simple steel balls at orbital velocity carried enormous kinetic energy. Sometimes the old solutions were the best solutions. Commander Vrath's fleet was being torn apart by ball bearings. Half his ships were now either destroyed or too damaged to fight. His invasion force was dying, killed by weapons that should have been obsolete. He faced a terrible choice: retreat and face shame, or continue fighting and possibly lose everything. Pride made the decision for him. He ordered his remaining ships to prepare landing forces. They would take the fight to the surface where human tricks would not work. On the ground, superior Zeltharian troops would overwhelm the primitive humans. He was sure of it. The landing craft launched, heading for sites across North America, Europe, and Asia. Vrath chose open areas away from major cities. He wanted space to establish bases and organize his forces. What he did not understand was that this played directly into human plans. On Earth, General Paul Martinez coordinated the global defense. Every nation had put aside their differences to face the common threat. Russian, American, Chinese, and European forces worked together, sharing intelligence and resources. Humanity was finally united, and that unity was about to be tested. Captain Linda Hayes coordinated drone operations from her command center. As the Zeltharian landing craft descended, she activated thousands of commercial drones. They were cheap civilian models, the kind used for farming and delivery, each one modified to carry a simple grenade. The drones swarmed the landing zones, crashing into alien troops and vehicles. Each drone cost less than $100 to convert. Each explosion might only kill or injure 1 or 2 aliens. But there were thousands of drones, and they could be replaced quickly. It was not about winning through superior force. It was about making every meter of ground cost the aliens dearly. Colonel Jake Morrison watched the first Zeltharian troops land in the Great Plains. His Razor Squad was positioned 3 kilometers away, hidden in farm buildings. Sergeant Amy Price studied the enemy through her scope, counting troops and identifying equipment. The aliens were setting up a defensive perimeter, their movements professional and efficient. They had obviously done this many times before on other worlds, but they had never done it on Earth, and that would make all the difference. Jake smiled grimly and gave the order to begin the ambush. Hidden artillery pieces opened fire from positions 5 kilometers away. The shells were simple, high-explosive rounds, nothing fancy or high-tech. Just old-fashioned artillery that humans had been using for over a century. The shells rained down on the alien position. The Zeltharian personal shields protected them from small arms fire, but they were not designed for artillery. The first volley killed 40 aliens instantly. The second volley scattered their formation and destroyed several vehicles. Private Kevin Nash watched the carnage through his binoculars and whistled softly. The aliens were tough, but they could be killed. That was all that mattered. If they could die, humans could win. Commander Vrath received reports of heavy casualties from all landing zones. His troops were being hit by artillery, drones, and ambushes. The humans were not fighting fair. They were using every dirty trick, every unconventional tactic, every weapon at their disposal. It was not civilized warfare. It was barbaric, but it was working. The Zeltharian forces pushed forward despite casualties. They had better armor, better weapons, and better training. But the humans had something the aliens could not match. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their entire species. That desperation made them dangerous in ways Vrath was only beginning to understand. Lieutenant Sophie Grant flew her Wraith fighter over a battlefield in Texas, providing air support for ground troops. She could see Zeltharian soldiers advancing on a human position. 3 months had passed since the Zeltharian fleet departed Earth's solar system. The physical wounds were healing slowly. Cities were being rebuilt. Factories that had produced weapons were now producing construction materials. Soldiers were returning home to their families. But the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. Colonel Jake Morrison stood at Arlington National Cemetery, looking at the endless rows of white markers. Each one represented a soldier who died defending Earth. The Razor Squad had lost 16 members during the war. 16 people who followed his orders into battle and never came home. Their names were carved in stone now, permanent reminders of the cost of survival. Sergeant Amy Price walked up beside him. Her arm had healed, but she still favored it sometimes. They stood in silence for a while, remembering the faces of the fallen. Finally, Amy spoke. She asked if Jake thought it would happen again. Would other aliens come to threaten Earth? Jake nodded slowly. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and now Earth was no longer hidden. Every advanced species knew about humanity. Some would be curious, some would be friendly, but others would see Earth as a threat that needed to be eliminated before humans became too powerful. The war was over, but the danger was not. At NASA headquarters, Dr. Helen Park worked with an international team of scientists studying captured Zeltharian technology. The aliens had left behind damaged ships, broken equipment, and weapon systems. Human engineers were taking them apart, learning how they worked, trying to understand technology that was centuries ahead of Earth's. Progress was slow, but steady. They had figured out the basics of the alien shield generators. The power systems were still mostly a mystery, but they were learning. Dr. Park estimated it would take 20 years to fully understand everything the Zeltharians had used. But humanity had 20 years. They had survived, and now they would use that time to prepare for the future. Lieutenant Sophie Grant was training the next generation of spacefighter pilots. The X-47 Wraith program had been expanded dramatically. Instead of 100 fighters, the military was building 1,000. The pilots needed to learn not just how to fly, but how to fight in three-dimensional combat against enemies with superior technology. Sophie taught them the lessons she had learned in battle. Speed and unpredictability were more valuable than armor. Small targets were harder to hit than large ones. Conventional weapons worked if you used them correctly. And most importantly, never give up no matter how bad the situation looked. Her students listened carefully. They were young, most of them barely 20 years old, but they understood the stakes. They had lived through the invasion. They had seen their cities bombed and their families threatened. They were determined that Earth would never be caught unprepared again. President Marcus Webb worked 18-hour days coordinating the global recovery effort. The United Earth Defense Alliance had been formed during the war, combining military forces from every nation into one unified command. Now they were trying to maintain that unity in peacetime, which was proving even harder than fighting together. Some nations wanted to return to the old ways, competing with each other for resources and influence. Others wanted to maintain the wartime cooperation. Webb spent his days negotiating, compromising, and occasionally threatening to get everyone working together. The alliance was fragile, but it was holding. Barely. General Paul Martinez had been promoted to Supreme Commander of Earth Defense Forces. His job was to prepare for the next invasion. He assumed there would be one. Maybe not next year or even next decade, but eventually some alien species would decide to test Earth again. When that happened, humanity needed to be ready. Paul was overseeing construction of new orbital defense platforms. These were not the simple weapons platforms from before. They were massive stations equipped with railguns, missile batteries, and experimental energy weapons reverse-engineered from Zeltharian technology. Each station could defend itself and provide overlapping fields of fire with neighboring stations. He was also expanding the submarine space fleet. The success of the underwater boats in space combat had been unexpected, but it proved valuable. New submarines were being built specifically for space operations. They would hide in asteroid fields, patrol the outer solar system, and provide early warning of approaching threats. Captain Linda Hayes coordinated the drone defense network. The Hornet swarm had been devastated during the battle, but new drones were being produced constantly. Thousands of them, all autonomous, all ready to sacrifice themselves to protect Earth. Linda believed in quantity over quality. One advanced weapon might fail, but 10,000 simple weapons could overwhelm any defense. She also oversaw the civilian drone program. Regular people could register their commercial drones to be used for defense if needed. Farmers, photographers, delivery companies, anyone with a drone could contribute. In peacetime, they used them normally. In war, they became weapons. It was a uniquely human solution, using everyday technology for military purposes. Commander Vrath stood before the Zeltharian High Council, delivering his report on the failed invasion of Earth. The council chamber was massive, filled with representatives from a dozen conquered species. They listened in silence as Vrath described the battle, the casualties, the retreat. Some council members were angry. They called Vrath a coward for retreating. They said the Empire looked weak now, that other species would rebel if they thought the Zeltharians could be defeated. They demanded he be punished for his failure, but others were thoughtful. They asked questions about human tactics, about their weapons, about their determination. Vrath answered honestly. He described how humans used their primitive technology as an advantage, how they fought with creativity born from desperation, how they refused to surrender even when facing certain death. One council member asked the critical question, could the Zeltharian Empire conquer Earth if they sent a larger fleet? Vrath considered his answer carefully. Yes, he said, they probably could. With enough ships, enough soldiers, enough resources, they could overwhelm human defenses through sheer numbers. But the cost would be enormous. Tens of thousands of Zeltharian casualties, hundreds of ships destroyed, years of fighting. And even if they won, they would control a hostile population that would resist forever. He recommended that Earth be declared a protected zone, not out of fear but out of practical calculation. Any species that fought as hard as humans would make terrible slaves but excellent allies. Better to wait, to watch, to see what humanity became. If they developed peacefully, make them trading partners. If they became aggressive, deal with them later when the Empire was stronger. The council debated for weeks. Eventually, they agreed to Vrath's recommendation. Earth would be left alone for now, but they would watch carefully. The council did not trust humans, but they respected them. That was something new in the galaxy. On Earth, life slowly returned to normal. Children went back to school, though they now had classes about alien species and space defense. Adults returned to work, rebuilding what had been destroyed. Scientists pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, trying to close the technology gap with the rest of the galaxy. But nothing was truly the same. Humanity had changed. They had faced extinction and survived. They had fought enemies from the stars and won. They knew now that they were not alone in the universe, and that knowledge changed everything. Jake Morrison eventually left active duty and started teaching at the military academy. He trained special operations soldiers, sharing the lessons he had learned in combat against the Ziltharians. His classes were always full. Everyone wanted to learn from the man who had led the first space assault against an alien fleet. Amy Price stayed in the service, rising through the ranks to become a major. She commanded a special operations unit, tasked with developing new tactics for fighting in space. Her team experimented with unconventional weapons and strategies, always looking for ways to turn human weaknesses into advantages. Sophie Grant became a test pilot for the new generation of spacecraft. Humanity was building its first true warships designed from the ground up for space combat. They incorporated lessons from the Ziltharian War and ideas from science fiction. Sophie flew them all, pushing the limits, finding the problems before they became fatal in combat. President Webb served 2 more years before retiring. His successor continued his policies of global cooperation and defense preparedness. The United Earth Defense Alliance became stronger, more organized, better equipped. Humanity was preparing for the day when the next threat would arrive, because everyone knew it would come. The galaxy was full of species, and not all of them would be friendly. Some would see humanity as potential allies, others would see them as threats, and some would see them as prey. But humanity was no longer the weak, divided species the Ziltharians had expected to find. They had been tested in fire and survived. They had learned that technology was not everything, that determination and creativity could overcome superior weapons. That unity made them stronger than any alien empire. Dr. Helen Park published her research on Ziltharian technology. Scientists around the world used it to advance human science. Within 10 years, humanity had developed their own shields. Within 15 years, they had their own faster-than-light engines.